Welcome back. In this lecture series, we're going to talk about Chapter 3.2, the New England Colonies, as well as Chapter 4.1, Commerce and Religion. The very first thing we're going to discuss in the settlement of New England is the concept of a dissenter. A dissenter is somebody who does not agree, particularly with the practice of a specific church. And the history of dissenters in England come from when Henry VIII separated his country from the Catholic Church. Many of the people that disagreed with Henry VIII's practices were persecuted. And in other words, they were mistreated, and many of them fled to find acceptance or tolerance in another place. Now, although we don't have a whole lot of time for Henry VIII, here is a very quick glimpse of the 6 wives of Henry VIII, and kind of notice what happened to some of them. The first place that was settled was Massachusetts, and the first group to settle here were the Pilgrims. This is a religious group that wanted to separate entirely from the Church of England. And the word pilgrim is a person who goes on a religious journey, and since they traveled so far, the name kind of stuck. They came for religious tolerance, and remember, tolerance is an acceptance of different opinions, and the Church of England didn't really accept their beliefs. They came over on the ship, the Mayflower, and the place that they settled was called Plymouth. Here is a cutaway view of the Mayflower. Notice everything from top to bottom, that it was a pretty tight squeeze. Now, the separatist pilgrims were initially living in the Netherlands, also known as Holland, but they knew that couldn't be their permanent home, so they asked the Virginia Company if they could get permission to settle the Americas. And the Virginia Company accepted. And as they were traveling towards Virginia, they got blown off course and ended up what we now know as Cape Cod, which is the little cape off of the coast of Massachusetts. When they got there, they realized they did not land within the limits of the Virginia Company's charter. So in other words, they were free from all government authority and the laws of England. So the men, being wise at the time, decided to establish and practice their own sort of self-government by creating laws known as the Mayflower Compact. When they got there, they also suffered a starving time, and this was about half of the Pilgrims were dead in the first winter. But they also learned how to grow crops and get along with helpful Native Americans such as Squanto. Now, the Puritans were a group of people that settled New England about 10 years after the Pilgrims did. The Puritans were a religious group that wanted to change or purify the Church of England rather than separate from it. And they were led by a gentleman known as Reverend John Winthrop. And from approximately 1629 to 1640, about 20,000 people came to this area. And this was known as the Great Migration. They came very well prepared, unlike the gentlemen of the Jamestown colony, and everyone worked hard for the good of the whole group. This were people like carpenters and farmers, and not just gentlemen adventurers. All of them belonged to the same church. In other words, they were all a part of the same congregation. And in these colonies, they started to form self-governments and follow what is known as the New England Way. And the New England Way emphasizes the concept of hard work. In other words, things like games and other forms of entertainment was a sign of laziness. The New England Way also emphasizes education, in which everyone could read the Bible. Even they're going to start to teach their children as well. And the concept of representative governments, where you have town meetings and where people eventually vote. This is the picture of the Pilgrims, while this is a picture of the Puritans. I'm just kidding. This is a picture, both pictures are of the Puritans of the John Winthrop as they arrive in the New World. Even though the Pilgrims and the Puritans are a little different, we must also realize that they were both from England, so they had English ancestry. Massachusetts is known as a seed colony because although many people started there, a lot of little other colonies started to kind of branch out from there. And one such colony is known as Connecticut. Now, the way that the Puritans worked, many people started to kind of disagree. And one such person, Thomas Hooker, set up their own government outside of Massachusetts, known as Connecticut. And one of their pieces is known as the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, which is going to expand the idea of representative government, and it is going to allow voting rights to non-church members, which is a pretty big deal. This is one of the first constitutions in the United States. This is a picture of Connecticut, but you can also see kind of how it grows and expands during the time of 1636 all the way up to the Revolution. The next colony we're going to talk about is New Hampshire, and New Hampshire was settled by a gentleman known as John Wheelwright, and they set up, again, another kind of compact, which is a contract really of how they're going to govern, that is going to run their colony. And then here we kind of have two inset maps. They're going to kind of show you where New Hampshire is in terms of the United States, in terms of the 13 colonies, and then a little bit zoomed in just north of Massachusetts. Last, we're going to talk about Rhode Island, and these were the first colony where people were actually banished and forced to leave the Massachusetts Bay Colony because they felt the New England way was too strict. Their leader of Rhode Island was a guy by the name of Roger Williams. And Roger Williams kind of had a few ideas. One, in which colonists should not have the right to take Native American land. Two, colonists should be not forced to attend church, nor should colonists be able to impose their religious beliefs on other people. And that the concept of church and state, or in other words, government, should be kept separate. Roger Williams was a Quaker, and we're going to learn more about Quakers in another lesson. And here's that lesson now. I'm going to read something from the text here. The name Quakers came from a leader's statement that they should, quote, tremble or quake at the word of the Lord. Quaker beliefs angered the Puritans. The Quakers believed God could be known directly through an inner light, and that Puritan sermons and ministers were obstacles to the direct experience of God. Because Quakers believed that women were spiritually equal to men, Quaker women served as preachers and missionaries. This was something that went extremely against the New England way, and many Quakers then fled to Rhode Island. If we look at this map, we have, it's kind of blurry, but you have the New Hampshire settlement, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. These are the four colonies that make up New England. And now we're on to Chapter 4, Section 1, and it's going to talk about commerce and religion. The region of New England was by far the most populated region in all the 13 colonies. But the biggest problem is, since they had such poor soil quality, farming was very difficult in New England. So they had to practice something known as subsistence farming, which is essentially growing just enough food for yourselves and then sometimes a little extra to trade in town. So something that was very common in New England was this concept of a common, separate meaning. This was shared land where activities took place and that farmers can kind of grow crops together. Along the coast, seaport towns started to kind of pop up, and they started to ship goods and provided a market for goods coming to New England. So instead of being a farming community, New England became something of a fishing and shipping community. And the Atlantic Ocean provided many economic opportunities for New England. Also, forests were a valuable resource. As they started to cut those down, they started sending large pine trees back to England to make more ships. This is a picture of the famed Boston Common, founded in 1634. This satellite image demonstrates that even common area still exists in such a large city of millions of people like Boston, Massachusetts. Now, since this was an English colony, the English still practiced the economic theory of what we call mercantilism. They wanted to profit off of their colonies, and the mother country is supposed to do that. So we would send our products back to England, and then we would make a profit, but they would actually make a larger profit. So in order to ensure that the English made more money, they passed something known as the Navigation Acts of 1651. One of the provisions of the Navigation Acts were that all goods had to be carried on English ships, or ships made in the colonies that were English. Tobacco and wood and sugar were only sold to England or in the colonies, so that means they couldn't sell them to France or to the Netherlands. European imports had to pass through English ports. In other words, things coming from other countries had to pass through the English hands first before they got to the colonies. And then officials would tax these goods that were not shipped to England. So if you wanted to export something to France, you had to pay more. So a lot of the colonists became very upset with the fact that they were losing their own money, so they started to smuggle, like Han Solo. Trade in New England consisted of three different types of trade. The first was just to trade with other colonies, like say Connecticut or Pennsylvania. The other is going to be the exchange of goods with Europe, so directly selling goods back to the mother country, or France or the Netherlands. And then the last is what's known as the triangular trade, and this was a trade that actually involved indirectly the use of slaves. And what it did, this is kind of how it works, it was an exchange for slaves and rum, for sugar and molasses. New England involved in the slave trade for a few years, but they really didn't live in their New England area. About only 2% of the population were slave. Now, that being said, there were some free African Americans in the New England area, but they were not necessarily treated as equals. This is a very simplified version of the triangular trade. I think your book on page 98 kind of shows it a little bit better. But from North America, you would get items, these exports such as sugar and tobacco, and particularly rum, that would go to Europe, and then they would use that to sell to African kings, and these African kings would then sell their prisoners of war into slavery and send these slaves to the Americas, particularly in the sugar plantations, where they would send more sugar to the colonies, and the colonies again would send it into Europe. So this cycle would continue to repeat for a couple hundred years. I think it's important to note that the Native Americans that were living in New England and the Europeans that came into New England had completely different ideas about land ownership. The Europeans felt that you could own individual land, and the Native Americans felt that it was more of a community thing, and tensions started to arise over the land use, and many Native American groups started to kind of band together because they were fearful of the growing European influence that was taking place in New England. One such leader, his name was Metacom of the Wampanoag tribe, later dubbed King Philip, led many tribes in an uprising against these Puritan colonies. So the English had turned to other rival tribes to learn the techniques in order to defeat the Wampanoag natives. And many Native Americans lost in this battle. They were sold into slavery, and more of their land was taken. So this is a timeline of King Philip's War, and it goes from about 1675 to 1676. You can see Metacom's travel, the major battles, and kind of where they went from Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. Last thing we're going to talk about is changes in Puritan society. As more and more people started to come to New England, the New England ways started to kind of go away. Puritan values made many rich, and religion kind of took a back seat to this influx in business. And immigrants threatened to take Puritan control. So eventually a new charter guaranteed religious freedom for all, not just Puritans. So the structure of the Puritans' way and how they kind of held power started to go away. And as a result, something happened known as the Salem witch trials. And this is a time period where girls were pretending to be accursed and bewitched, and they started accusing others of witchcraft, and it led to this mass hysteria where 19 people were found guilty and put to death. Now we're going to go over a document-based question about the Salem witch trials, so we're not going to really go into it in this slideshow, but it is some pretty crazy stuff.